Okay, welcome to tonight's class. Tonight we're going to do something a little bit different. Instead of focusing on the weekly Parsha, we're going to explore the first Mishnah from Pirkei Avos, from Ethics of Our Fathers, and the uniqueness about Pirkei Avos and the time that we're currently in. Most of the entire Talmud, all of the Mishnahs, the entire oral tradition. Welcome, Saul. Was all dealing with all kinds of every kind of legal situation and a position that a person may be in, discussing all the aspects of the various mitzvahs, both mitzvahs between us and Hashem, and between us and a fellow, how to behave, how to treat other people, all the judicial laws of how courts are supposed to judge based on various scenarios, and it goes at very much length and depth into all kinds of various instances and circumstances, what the various rulings would be, all kinds of conversations that are recorded from the Talmudic times. Going back for a moment before the Mishnah, at the time of the giving of the Torah, when the Torah was given to Moshe on Mount Sinai, he was given the written Torah. So as Maimonides describes in the introduction to his work of the Mishnah Torah, he describes how when Hashem spoke a verse, he talked a verse, told Moses to write it down, and then he also gave him the oral tradition, the explanation behind it. So, of course, at the time of the giving of the Torah, that's when God spoke. Hashem spoke the 10 Commandments, the Aseret HaDibrot, and then he was on the mountain for 40 days, 40 nights, came back down, and afterwards, after going back up on the mountain a number of times, he came back down and began teaching the people on, just after Yom Kippur, began teaching the people what Hashem had taught him, exactly how the Torah was transcribed, whether it was written down in pieces and then put together as a whole, or he just taught them bit by bit, and when he was done, he then transcribed everything and wrote it down in one piece. There's a different Talmudic debates about how that worked, but in general, the only Torah that was written down, the only words of Torah that were written down was just the Tanakh, the Torah, and then later on the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the writings, the Ketuvim. Those things were written down, and for many generations, all of the other laws and traditions were all just given over orally from one generation to the next, from one leader to the next. And tradition in Judaism is so important that we track back all the way to Moses, the main leaders of the Jewish people throughout history, from the time of the giving of the Torah up until the Mishnah was written down, and later on is all recorded of who were the main teachers of Torah at that time. And again, Maimonides, the Rambam, in the beginning of his book of the Mishnah Torah, goes through that whole list, an order of how it was transmitted, what the generations were, the leaders of the generations transmitted one to the next. So, especially since the word that was written, the Torah itself, and the words in Tanakh are impossible to understand without the explanations behind it. So, for example, the mitzvah of having a mezuzah on your doorpost, the Torah just tells us that you should write these words on your doorposts. Uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha v'sharecha. You should write down these words and place them on your doorposts and on the entries on your gates. What does that mean? How do we know that which exact words, where it begins, where it ends? How do we know the way the words are supposed to be written? The crowns that are on the words, it has to be black ink on parchment, in a scroll. You have to place on the right side of your doorpost. And all those details are all oral tradition passed down from Moses at Mount Sinai to the next generation. So because all the tradition, all the explanations, was all just passed orally from one generation to the next, obviously it's important to have saintly leaders throughout each generation that were capable of this task of passing and ensuring the continuity of the Torah from one generation to the next. Of course, parents taught their children, and each family was obligated on their own. But there were the leaders that were their task with, besides for answering everyone's questions, also making sure that the integrity of the Torah being taught remains the same. After a period of time, during the end of the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, second temple, and afterwards when it was destroyed, at that point, that was the time of the sages of the Mishnah, of the Tanaim, which Rebbe, known as Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, he was also, because he was such a special, unique teacher of Torah, he was known just by the name Rebbe, rabbi, teacher, which Rebbe in Hebrew actually means teacher. And that's how he was known, just by the name teacher, because he was such a special teacher. And he felt at that point in time that Jews began to be dispersed around the world in various areas and places. And he felt that at that point, if the oral tradition would not be transcribed, committed to a book, then at that point he felt that it may soon be lost, and there would be no one to continue to teach these ideas, all the laws and reasons behind it to the next generation, and actually came together with the consensus of most of the leading halachic authorities at that time, and got together, and he authored what we know today as the Mishnah. In Hebrew it's called the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, the 6 orders of the Mishnah. It's also called, with its acronym for Shisha Sidrei, which is Shin Samach, is an acronym called Shas. So the Mishnah or Talmud is sometimes referred to as Shas, which is just Shin Samach, which is the acronym for the Shisha Sidrei, the 6 orders of the Mishnah. And because the Mishnah was broken down into 6 categories, 6 sections, and then within each section there's many subcategories of each tractate on its own, and then broken down into chapters as well. So those the Mishnah, because it was still committed to being taught orally, when it was written down in his time, even with the consensus of the majority of the sages of the time, was written down in a very brief manner, just kind of like notes, so that you can look at it and remember all the details of it, which that is the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is much shorter. At the end, the next generation from the Mishnah, the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, the 6 orders of the Mishnah, the Shasa, then came afterwards the Talmud, which which means to learn, expand upon it more. That's when they took the Mishnah, and more discussions broke down into all kinds of debates of what the Mishnah actually meant, especially because it was written in such a concise manner. And there's pages and pages of Talmud, Gemara, also known as Gemara, the Aramaic word for learning. So Talmud is a Hebrew word, Gemara is an Aramaic word for learning, comes into the explanation of the Mishnah. So that's the basic background of what the Mishnah and Talmud are, the oral tradition, which goes through the entire spectrum of Jewish tradition, law, stories, ideas, and all kinds of ways that we can learn and extrapolate lessons from various verses in the Torah, etc. But most of the tractates of the Mishnah and of the Talmud are all discussing things that are required of us, how we must behave, what we must do, how do we keep Shabbos, all the details, how it's done appropriately, how do we treat other people, how do we fulfill the various laws of harvest in Israel, how do we give charity, 10% to tzedakah that we're supposed to give, and all the various different ideas are discussed in the Mishnah, but it's all laws. Well, how we are meant to behave, how we're supposed to behave, and how it's mandatory according to Jewish law, according to what Hashem wants us that we should aspire to do. That's all in the Mishnah, the broader sense. The Talmud, including the Gemara, discusses all of that. The one exception of which is Pirkei Avot. The Hebrew word Pirkei Avot, the actual literal translation of Pirkei Avot is the chapters of our fathers. The English translates ethics of our fathers. What is Pirkei Avot? In Talmud and Tractate Baba Kama says if someone wants to be a chassid, they should study Pirkei Avot. They should study ethics of our fathers. What does that mean? The idea, the definition in Talmud and Mishnah of what is a chassid. A chassid is, the definition of a chassid is somebody that tries to do beyond the letter of the law. Not just what they're obligated to do, but to do it much more than the obligation. Because we want to enhance our connection to Hashem, our service to Hashem, and become better people, better Jews, better in our connection. Therefore, we don't just do the bare minimum. We want to improve ourselves and try to do it in a much better way, beyond what we're actually required to do. And that's the idea of the Mishnah, of the idea of the Tractate of Avot, of Pirkei Avos, ethics of our fathers. Is the whole thing is not discussing what we need to do, it's discussing ideas that are beyond the letter of the law, beyond what we do, more ethical things, more things that we want to do, and we want to become better people, not just what's required of us. That is what Pirkei Avot is called. Why was it given the name of Avot, our fathers? Sounds like an interesting title for a book to teach us lessons of how to behave beyond the letter of the law. Seems like there's many other words that would be befitting to describe this section, this tractate, or in Hebrew is called Masechta, or Aramaic Masechta, the tractate of Mishnah. So why is it called Avot? Some of the reasons why it's called Avot is, number one, because the Hebrew word Avos doesn't just mean fathers, but it also can be categories. Like we have the 39 Avot Melachot, the 39 principal categories of work that we cannot do on Shabbos. So because this is so important, it's such an important work that teaches how to behave beyond the letter of the law. Therefore, this is kind of the impetus for understanding and appreciating more and doing more, not just learning and doing because we have to do it, but doing it because we enjoy it. We're trying to build our connection, and therefore that's reflected in the word Avot, the fathers, the principles, the leading guide of how to become a better person, which leads us into the next interpretation of Avot, is that this is the beginning. That from this you should do this first, and then you can learn the rest of the Talmud in a better way. So Avot being the categories, the introduction, and then if we learn Avot first, we have to take the principles, ideas taught by the sages in ethics of our fathers. Then we can then go on to study the rest of the Torah, the rest of the oral tradition, as well as the written tradition in a better way. Another idea reflected in the name Avot, fathers are the first educators. Fathers, mothers, parents are the first educators. When we're talking about education, not just is it important to teach appropriately and teach our children the appropriate way of living, but as we all know, if we want those that we're trying to influence to become, to act and behave a certain way and hold by a certain standard, then we as educators need to hold ourselves to a much higher standard. And then hopefully they'll take something of that. And therefore it was given the name of Avot, reflecting the idea of teaching morals and ethics. If we want to educate ourselves and those around us, then we're obligated to hold ourselves to a higher standard, and therefore it's reflected in the name Avot. So, that brief introduction, we will continue on to study some of Pirkei Avot. I did forget to mention as well that this particular time period between Pesach and Shavuot, there's exactly 6 weeks between Pesach and Shavuos. We have 7 weeks, but the first one is during the holiday of Pesach. So after Pesach ends until Shavuos, we have 6 Shabboses. We have 6 Shabbats between them. The Tractate of Avot also has 6 chapters. And because, as we discussed last week, the idea of the Sfirat HaOmer is to improve ourselves and improve our behaviors and internalize it in a much deeper way. It's also the time that we're getting closer to the summer, where it's starting to get warmer outside and people start feeling a little more lax sometimes in their behavior, and therefore it's custom around the world in most Jewish communities to study one chapter of Pirkei Avot each week on Shabbat between Pesach and Shavuot, and in some communities, Chabad community as well, it's continued throughout the summer up until Rosh Hashanah. Okay, let's enough with the introduction. Let's jump right into it here. Share my screen. And see, give me a thumbs up if my screen changes. Okay, perfect. Let's go back. Okay, so let us move right along here. We will just be discussing the very first Mishnah, where the Torah came from, and the different generations that it passed through that are important for us. So let's look at the first Mishnah here. This is Mishnah number 1 of chapter 1. Moshe kibel Torah mi Sinai. So Moses received the Torah at Sinai and passed it on to Joshua, who further passed it on to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. They said 3 things: be cautious in judgment, establish many students, and make a safety fence around the Torah. So if we look at this Mishnah, there's a few interesting things that we notice. Number 1 is Moses received the Torah where? At Sinai. It doesn't tell us that Moshe received the Torah from Hashem, from God. It says specifically he received it at Sinai. Then, afterwards, the next part, the Mishnah continues and tells us he passed it on to Joshua, his student Yehoshua, and then further passed it on to the elders, the generations called the Zekanim, and then from the Zekanim to the prophets, the Nevi'im, and then afterwards the Nevi'im passed it on to the men of the Great Assembly, the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. The Anshe Knesset Hagdolah were the ones that established many of the traditions that we have today that are of rabbinic origin, come from the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, like the liturgy that we use in davening. The entire format of the Siddur was formed by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, as well as the terminology that we use, the wording that we use when we do brachot, when we do blessings, that we, the standard Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Asher Kitshanu Mitzotav V'Tzivanu was all instituted by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, and there's many others that they instituted. So here, from the time of the giving of the Torah at Sinai up until the time period of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah was almost 1,000 years, and it's split up here into kind of 5 categories. It doesn't list the times of the Shoftim, the judges, the Jewish judges that was along the way, and other intervals are not mentioned. There's 5 specific time periods that are mentioned, and we see further that there's specific words that are used to describe those time periods. As well, we'll notice that the men of the Great Assembly said 3 things. They gave us 3 specific instructions. So obviously they taught many things. The Mishnah is telling us 3 specific things that was a very high focus of the sages of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, of the men of the Great Assembly. One of which was to be cautious in judgment. Second is to establish many students, and of course making a fence around the Torah. So let's look at the commentary on this Mishnah, and then we'll delve in a little bit deeper on the deeper meaning of the Mishnah and what we can learn from it, why it's so important for us today. So the Bar Tanura, this is Rabbi Avadia Bar Tanura, came from Italy. He He lived about 500 years ago, and he wrote a commentary on the Mishnah. So Rabbi Vadia Bar Tanura explains that Moses received the Torah at Sinai, and he says, why is it so important to mention the word Sinai, that it came from Sinai, or that it came from Hashem? I say this because this tractate is not based on understanding the Torah's mitzvot and legal precepts, like all other Talmudic tractates, but it is entirely ethics and morals, and similar secular works are also common. Therefore, the Tana began this Mishnah stating that Moses received the Torah at Sinai. The ethical and moral teaching it contains are not man-made, but were given by Hashem, by God, at Sinai. As a side note, a Tana is what the sages of the Mishnah were referred to as. A Tana, or that period was called the period of the Tanaim. The next generation after the Mishnah, which we discussed, the Gemara, the Talmud, that was the sages of the Talmud. The next generation were referred to as Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara. So the Tana, the sage, begins this Mishnah by stating that Moses received the Torah at Sinai. The reason is because there's many good people that said lots of good things. There's many people that said good things that are quoted. You have quotes from Winston and Churchill and all kinds of others that may have said inspiring things that are quoted often. So one may think when they learn the Mishnah, when they learn this tractate of Mishnah, which is just ethic and morals, that it's just another inspirational book. People came up with their own ideas of how to inspire people to become better. And therefore, the Bar Tanura says that Rabbi Vadia Bar Tanura says that the purpose of stating that came from Hashem at Sinai is that these, although it's not commands of how you must behave, it's an ethical and moral guide of how to behave more than the law requires. These are not man-made, man-given, but they were given by Hashem at Mount Sinai to Moses together with the rest of the Torah. And therefore, when we're studying, it's not just studying a nice thing that somebody said, but it's studying the wisdom of Hashem. And he mentions again, what does it mean from Sinai? Obviously, it's from he who was revealed at Sinai. It wasn't that he just received it from a mountain. It's from Hashem, the God that revealed himself at Sinai. Let's continue looking at his explanation of the other time periods. So he says Moshe received the Torah at Sinai, gave it to Yehoshua, to Joshua, which then gave it to passed it on to the elders, and then to the prophets. To the elders, the Bar Tanura comments, they lived for a long time after Joshua, and they transmitted the Torah to other elders until the beginning of the prophetic period, led by Eli the Kohen and Samuel, Shmuel Hanavi. So Eli the Kohen, Eli and the prophet Samuel were the beginning of the prophets, and they then passed it on to the men of the Great Assembly. Who are the men of the Great Assembly? So he tells us they were 120 elders. There's 120 sages. He mentions some of them by names: Zerubbabel, Sraya, Reliah, Mordechai, Bilshan. They returned from the exile together with Ezra. This body included people like Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, Nehemiah ben Chachlaya, and their peers. And the Mordechai Bilshan here is the Mordechai in the Purim story. He was also called Bilshan because the Hebrew word lashon, which means language, and because it was important for him to understand any litigants that came to that had arguments, that wanted resolutions to their arguments, or people that had questions. They may have come from anywhere in the world. So therefore, it was important to speak that someone on the of the Sanhedrin, someone on the court of 70, was able to understand all the different various languages. So, which was part of why one of the reasons he was nicknamed Mordechai Bilshan, because he understood 70 different languages. What did the men of the Great Assembly say? So they said three things, and the Bar Tanura elaborates on that. They said many things, but these three teachings are regarding the continuation of the Torah. Why are these three things mentioned in this Mishnah? Because over here we're discussing the order of transmission of the oral tradition from one generation to the next. So because we mentioned these 5 generations, when it comes the men of the Great Assembly, now we mention 3 important points that one needs to know in the continuation of the Torah. What are the 3 things that we mentioned? Number 1 was be cautious in judgment. If a judgment comes before you once, twice, and a third time, don't assume that the verdict is the same as the previous cases, but be cautious, meaning deliberate before passing judgment. So if somebody learned something, or somebody tastes a food once, if they see that same food again, they'll automatically know what it tastes like. Someone comes and asks for advice, wants advice in their life about something. You go and see, what did other people previously do, and just do the same thing if they were in the same situation. That's when it comes to just generally looking for advice. You can, if it's the same situation, repeat the same advice that worked last time, will probably work again. But when it comes to judgment, the sages caution, and when it comes to judgment, even if it's the second or third time, you should still deliberate and look at all the details and research the argument, research the sides of the case exactly as if it was the very first time. And that's one of the methods of continuing on the Torah for the next generation, to make sure it's precise and exact, to be careful in passing judgment and research it properly each time. Number 2, we said establish many students. Why is that so important? So the Bartanura gives us an example, as opposed to Rabbi Gamliel, who said that any students whose inside and outside are not equal should not enter the study hall. One should teach Torah to everyone without investigation, as long as they do not have a bad reputation. So in the Haggadah, which we just came from Pesach, as part of the Haggadah story, we read about how Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says that he was like 70 years old. There's a whole story that this Talmud describes how he became a leader at the young age of 17, young age of 18, very young age, and he went to sleep and he prayed to Hashem. He davened. He's like, what should I do? People are not going to, he looks like a young kid. Nobody's going to respect him. And he woke up with 17 strands, 17 rows of white hairs in his beard, so he looked more prominent, and people, he gained a little more respect. Anyways, that story happened when Rabbi Gamliel, which was very particular who he accepted to study with, who he accepted into his yeshiva. And one of his qualifications to pass the test, if you can come into his yeshiva, if he felt that you were 100% legitimate and equal on how you portray yourself and how the person behaved inside, how they felt inside. If they were inside, what they spoke and how they represented themselves was the same as what they were really feeling, and the level they were holding inside, where nobody knows about it, then he would accept him into the yeshiva. He would accept the elite, the people that he felt were, the real deal. But anyone that was a little bit, not quite, he didn't feel was 100% at that level, he wouldn't allow them inside to study. Part of that was because it just came after tremendous devastation amongst the Jewish people, so he felt that he have to be very careful who were teaching Torah to. But anyways, there was an outcry of how he was, a whole story of how it became known that Hashem was not happy with the way that he was treating people and not accepting others to learn. And at a certain point, he was removed from his position, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was then installed in his place. And the Talmud tells us that at that point there were 800 benches added to the study hall. Because of the influx, all of a sudden, anyone that wanted to study was invited to come learn, and there were thousands of more students that came to study under Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So therefore, the Mishnah warns us that a person should establish many students, not like Rabbi Gamliel that only wanted to select few. You have many students. Of course, from the many students, a smaller group of them will continue on their studies further, and the more quantity of students that you teach, they teach other people, the more chances of the Torah continuing on to the next generation. And the final statement that they said in this Mishnah is make a safety fence around the Torah, a perimeter to ensure one does not violate a biblical prohibition. For example, rabbinic prohibitions against illicit relationships and Shabbat laws, as the verse says, guard my commandments, meaning enact guards for my commandments. So the Torah tells us to shmartem es mishmarti, you should guard, you should guard my commandments. What does it mean to guard them? The sages teach us it means to place guards, rails in place that we would never come to violate a Torah prohibition. So some quick examples of that is the Torah tells us many illicit relationships that a person is not allowed to have, and the rabbis rabbinically instituted the prohibition of the concept called yichud, that people that are not allowed to have relations with each other should never be secluded in a place by themselves. If you don't seclude yourself, if a man and woman that are not allowed to have relations are not secluded in a private space by themselves where no one else can come in, then you won't come to violate a Torah prohibition eventually of coming to an illicit relationship. Shabbat laws as well. There's many things that we cannot do on Shabbos. For example, we can't write. We don't make fires. We don't cook. The rabbis instituted rabbinically was added that we shouldn't even touch things that we're not allowed to utilize them for their purpose on Shabbos. So not only shouldn't we write with a pen on Shabbat, we shouldn't even pick it up. If it's in our way, it needs to be moved. It can be moved in an unusual manner, but generally not handling in the regular way objects that we're prohibited to use on Shabbos. So those are just some examples. And the idea of course, is ensuring that the Torah itself remains intact for the next generations, and by placing these safeguards in place, it will make sure that we never end up violating Torah rules itself. But of course, all these three lessons that the Anshe Knesset Gedolah taught us are all having to do with the continuation of tradition. What's special about Sinai? Why does this Mishnah specifically use the term that Moshe received the Torah from Sinai? We find the term Sinai used often. For example, Moses received the Torah at Sinai. Another example of a place that we use the word Sinai, a law given to Moses at Sinai. In Hebrew, it's called the halacha leMoshe miSinai. It's a law. Where do we know certain laws from? We know laws because it's a tradition that it was given to Moses at Mount Sinai, and he passed it on to the next generation. But we don't have an actual source in the Torah, in the Torah itself, in the written Torah, for specific things. But the term which is used to reference it is also not that Moses received, not that it's a law given to Moses from God, but it's a law given to Moses at Sinai. There's another expression in the Talmud. Everything a seasoned student will originate was already said to Moses at Sinai. When we extrapolate and we delve deeper into study of Torah and come and elaborate on it, and new books are written, new works, halachic works are written, or works of drash or pilpul are written on the Torah. The Talmud tells us that anything that was taught in Torah, if it's actually done in the appropriate way with the appropriate tools that the Torah gave us to use, then those laws themselves were also given to Moses at Sinai. And they were just hidden for all this time, and then they were revealed by the students that found these ideas and then revealed them. But again, the term used is Moses at Sinai. What is the significance of the term Sinai? The point that these statements are conveying is that Hashem is the source, that God is the source. God is everywhere. So why is the term Sinai used? Why is the term Sinai used and not? We should say that we receive the Torah from God, the law given. It's a halacha l'Moshe from Hashem. It's like a law given to Moses from God. Why do we keep mentioning Sinai or Sinai? The sages relate that when the time for the giving of the Torah arrived, each mountain made an argument for why it should be the site for the giving of the Torah. Mount Tabor argued that it is the highest mountain. Mount Carmel argued that it assisted the splitting of the sea, etc. God responded, "Why do you all desire the Torah? You are haughty, and this is a blemish." The mountain God desires to rest his presence on is Mount Sinai, the most humble of all mountains. So the sages tell us, the Medrash tells us that when it came time for the giving of the Torah, and Hashem wanted to use a mountain to give the Torah on, the various mountains started having an argument between themselves. The ideas of where should the Torah be given. The tallest one wanted to be given on it. The other mountains that had various specialties to them came and argued that they should be given on them specifically. And Hashem responds to all of them that he does not desire to give the Torah on a mountain. He wants to give it on the most humble of all mountains. This comes from, here we'll skip over, this is the Medrash where this comes from, that the mountains had various arguments. Let's skip down to the last of these paragraphs here, the bottom of this page, the screen. I will choose Mount Sinai, God says, the smallest of you, as the verse says, with the lofty and the holy ones I dwell, and with the crushed and humble in spirit. So he says he wants to give it on the smallest of the mountains, because although I dwell, Hashem says, with the holy, with the lofty and holy ones, it's together with those that are crushed and humbled in spirit. And therefore he chose a mountain which is the lowest of the rest. So the question can be asked, if humility is so important, and therefore he's giving on the lowest of the mountain, the Torah should not have been given on a mountain at all, rather in a valley, or at least in a flat terrain. And if there is some importance to height, then the Torah should have been given on the mountains taller than Mount Sinai. There are plenty of other mountains that were much taller. So what exactly was that conversation that Hashem is saying that he's giving the Torah on the lowest of the mountains? The answer is that the goal of the giving of the Torah was to combine these two opposing traits, humility and pride. Acceptance of the Torah requires both characteristics. We must be firm and proud and not be ashamed of those who mock our observance. So on one hand, we have to be very firm in our beliefs, very proud of who we are, not worry about those that mock us. The haters are plenty, but we know what we have to do. The Code of Jewish Law opens with the very first law in Shulchan Aruch, and the Code of Jewish Law teaches us that we should not bow to any foreign influences and study Torah and observe mitzvot with pride and strength. At the same time, we also need humility. The sages teach that God cannot stand haughty people, and Torah and mitzvot require humility. When my soul is like dust to all, then we can have an open heart to Torah. This last quote comes from the conclusion of the Amidah, the conclusion of the Shmona Esrei, the Amidah, the very end of the Amidah. We say that our soul is like dust, and afterwards we continue, Psach libi b'sarasecha, open my heart to your Torah. But first, what is the preface to our request of opening our heart to your Torah is, in the Hebrews, v'nafshi ka'afar lakoltia, that my soul is like dust to all. So when we have that humility to begin with, then our hearts can be open to Torah. So the idea is that number one, there needs to be pride. In Hebrew, the word for arrogance and pride is actually the same word. It's gava. Gava, lihitga, is to be proud, and also it's the same word which means to be arrogant. In English, we can split the two, but the concept is that, of course, arrogance is a bad thing, whereas pride, being proud and firm in our beliefs and who we are, that is of extreme importance. And therefore, although it's important to have a mountain, we can't have a tall mountain, we don't need arrogance, but we do need a little mountain. We need pride and firmness in our beginnings, and then we can serve Hashem out of humility, recognizing that everything that we have comes from Hashem, and our ability to study, our ability to learn, our ability to have all our needs met and be successful in all our areas that we're successful from, we recognize that the only reason we have all that is because it comes from Hashem, it comes from God, and therefore, because it comes from Hashem, there's nothing to brag about. He gave me abilities, and I utilized them, and therefore we got to where we are. Here is the very first opening statement of the Shulchan Aruch. Yehuda ben Tema says, "Be bold as a leopard, swift as an eagle, fast as a deer, and strong as a lion to fulfill the will of your Father in heaven." bold as a leper means not to be ashamed before scoffers. So the very first sentence that Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema says is that to be bold as a leopard is to not to be ashamed, to be proud of who we are, and not to do things different because people mock us. Pride and humility are not contradictory. The pride and strength we are supposed to have doesn't derive from our own sense of self-importance. We are supposed to know full well our true state, that everyone else is better than us. We are the lowest of mountains, so we constantly recognize that there are others that are utilizing their strengths much better than we are. Nevertheless, we act with pride and confidence in our Torah and mitzvot because we know that we are fulfilling God's will. We are fully invested in fulfilling God's will, and this gives us the greatest strength and confidence, dismissing all obstacles from our path. So when we have this pride and firmness and being certain that the path that we're on, fulfilling what Hashem wants, is where we're supposed to be. This is the true path. This is the true place we're supposed to be. Then it doesn't matter what anybody else says because we're completely focused on where we need to go and what we need to do, and therefore it's irrelevant what others have to say, what others think, and that helps us to dismiss all the obstacles in our path and continue fulfilling what Hashem wants. So the idea of humility is not just saying, that I can't do anything, I'm not capable, there's people much better than me. It's recognizing with pride, this is my responsibility, this is what I should be doing, and being humble enough to fulfill our responsibilities, fulfill our duties, be the best that we could be, and be proud of it, despite all the challenges that come our way. So this is the first lesson from the Mishnah of the importance of the Torah coming from Sinai, coming from Sinai rather than coming from Hashem. To point out this idea that we need to have the pride coupled with humility. We can be absolutely humble, at the same time be confident and strong in our acceptance and observance of the Torah and with complete devotion. Any comments or questions so far? Okay, let's go on to the next section of the Mishnah, discussing the chain of tradition. The Mishnah's intention is not to list the chain of Torah tradition. This is evident from the fact that there were many more generations between Moses and the men of the Great Assembly than what the Mishnah includes. Maimonides provides a full list in his introductions to his commentary on the Mishnah and the Mishnah Torah. He provides a whole list of 40 generations or more of how the Torah was given from one generation to the next. The fact that this Mishnah explicitly states 5 specific intervals, 5 specific time periods, is because there's something much deeper that the Mishnah is trying to teach us. The Mishnah's goal is to teach us about the character traits that are necessary in order to study Torah. Those necessary traits are those traits of Moses, Joshua, the elders, the prophets, and the men of the Great Assembly. The subject is not actions that need to be done as a preparation for study Torah, but the character traits a person needs to possess. So the Mishnah over here is discussing what are the character traits that a person needs to have in order to approach their study of Torah and observance of mitzvahs in the best possible way. What is the appropriate approach to take to ensure that we will study in the appropriate way? And the 5 lessons, the 5 traits that we should be cognizant of, that we should recognize, are the traits that were exemplified by Moses, by his student Yehoshua, by Joshua, and by those called the Zekanim, the elders, the prophets, the Nevi'im, and the men of the Great Assembly, the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. So we'll briefly go through what each of these 5 generations represent, what we can learn from them. Moses represents the concept of humility. Humility is a necessary character trait in order to study Torah. This was exemplified by Moses, the most humble person, and also expressed by the fact that Torah was the giving of the Torah was on Mount Sinai. We are instructed to learn from God's conduct, to learn from the way that Hashem behaves, and God chose to give the Torah specifically on the small Mount Sinai because humility is a required quality for Torah. And this is why it's mentioned that Moses received the Torah from Sinai. He received the Torah on Mount Sinai, which there was pride together coupled with the humility, and he exemplified that idea of humility as well. We know that the Torah tells us that Moses was the greatest, most humble person that ever lived on planet Earth. How could it be that Moses, being such a great person that he was so humble? Even though he certainly knew all of his great qualities, he knew that he was the leader of the Jewish people, he experienced all these interactions with Hashem, with God, that no one else had throughout all history. But he recognized that it was all coming from Hashem, coming from God, and perhaps if someone else would have his same abilities and capabilities to do things, perhaps they would have done a much better job than he. Perhaps if he would have been placed in someone else's shoes, he would have done a far worse job than they. And therefore, that's one of the methods that he used to maintain that humility. So humility is exemplified by Moses. The next important piece to studying Torah, once we're proud and firm in our beliefs, we're humble, ready to accept what Hashem wants from us, the next step is to be like Yehoshua. Joshua exemplified the idea of complete devotion. Regarding Joshua, the verse states, he would not depart from the tent. Lo yamish mitoch ha'ol. He did not leave from the tent of Moses, from the tent of his teacher. Joshua had many qualities, but now we are discussing his Torah-related qualities, and his absolute devotion was his greatest. Joshua studied Torah diligently with complete devotion. So when Moses went up on Mount Sinai, after the giving of the Torah to receive the Luchot, and afterwards the whole story with the golden calf came about, where was Joshua, where was Yehoshua this entire time? He was at the foot of the mountain. His teacher went up Mount Sinai. He was there waiting for the moment that he'd come back down, so that way, as soon as he comes back, he can continue to study Torah. In fact, when Moses was going to pass on, he wanted one of his children to take over the leadership of the Jewish people. And Hashem informed him that no, it will be Yehoshua, it will be Joshua, because of his complete devotion and dedication to constantly studying Torah from Moshe and not barely leaving him for a moment for his own needs. He was constantly trying to be next to him and study from him and learn from him at every given opportunity. So therefore, Joshua is the one that exemplifies and represents complete devotion to the study of Torah, and that's part of the reason that he was the next leader to take over after Moses. The next paragraph here, after we have the quality of humility, we are told that our studies should be with complete devotion, never leaving the tent. We should have no other pursuits. Our sole concern should be the tent of Torah study. Of course, doesn't mean that all of us should just sit and study Torah the entire day and night, but the times that we do set for the study of Torah should be dedicated to what we're doing. If we want to study Torah, we should put aside all of the other things that may be disturbing us, disconnect from everything else, not worry. The world can do its thing. We can turn off our phones, turn off our disturbances that may disturb us, try to remove ourselves from being able to be disturbed by anything else, and really focus on what we're trying to accomplish, what we're trying to study. And for those periods of time, a half hour here, a half hour in the morning, an hour in the evening, or however we set up our study of Torah, it's important that those times of study are set, and when we are diligent to not be disturbed by anything else and focus on our task at hand. That way we can study Torah in a better way. So step number 1 is our pride together with the humility, exemplified by Moses. Step number 2 is devotion like Yehoshua. Next step is the step reflected in the Zekanim, the elders, which is exertion, working at it, working hard at it. The above-mentioned qualities of humility and complete focus are prerequisites for Torah study, but they are not sufficient. The study itself must be done with toil and exertion. We should put effort into it. This was exemplified by the zakenim, the elders. The Hebrew word zaken is an abbreviation of one who has acquired wisdom. So if you look at the Hebrew word, back a second. If you look at the Hebrew word for zakenim, is zaken is zayin kufnon. The zayin represents the word zeh, and the second two letters kufnon represent kana. The first letters of kana, which is our acquire. Zaken, an elder, doesn't physically mean a person that's old or elderly. It means that they're elderly in wisdom. It's a person that has acquired wisdom, the person that has acquired what elderly people represent, which that's the idea of acquiring wisdom, becoming wise and understanding. How does one become wise? Similar to every other enterprise or idea that a person wants to do. If a person wants to exercise, it's not it doesn't usually work by sitting by a computer and just moving our fingers and typing on our keyboard. Won't do us very good for a lot of exercise. If you want to exercise, you have to work out a little, break a sweat. We work, then it will actually accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. A person wants to be successful in any area, we have to work hard at it, put an effort in. The more effort we put in, the more that we get out of it. As the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos itself mentions later on, Lefum tzara agra, according to the pain is the gain. According to how much effort we put in, that's what we get out of it. The more that we put effort into Torah, the more that we can gain understanding and appreciation of it. So once we have the humility, we have the devotion, then we have to put in the effort. We put aside all disturbances. We're focused. Once we're focused, we actually have to work at it, try to understand it, ask questions, delve deeper into it. The more that we work at it, the more that we exert ourselves, the better we'll understand. The only way to acquire Torah, like a zakan, zeshakanachach, one that acquired wisdom, how do we acquire Torah so that it becomes like our possession, is through exertion. When we exert ourselves over Torah, it is not like a gift or an inheritance which comes automatically. It is a possession which we have acquired through our own effort. So of course Torah is a gift that was given to each of us on Mount Sinai. Torah was given as a gift to all of us. But if we want to personalize it and make it our own, not just something that was gifted to us, lots of times we receive gifts and it just sits on a shelf. We don't really care much about it. We don't use it much. We just don't want to give it away because it's meaningful that somebody gave it to us. But if we want that the Torah should actually affect us, we should have to take it off the shelf, study it, focus on it, and put effort in and try to understand to the best of our ability, and then it will become our own. Then we come to the fourth step, which is the step reflected in the prophets. What is a prophet? A navi. In order to understand Torah properly, we need special divine assistance. As the Talmud says, in order for a person to merit that their Torah rulings should be accepted, they need divine assistance. This is the underlying concept of prophecy, divine assistance. What is a prophecy? Prophecy is that Hashem comes to the person and speaks to them, teaches them something that they should tell other people. It's something which is completely divine from Hashem, that everyone recognizes and agrees that prophecy is divine. When we want to study Torah, many times a person can study, they can work at something. Who says we're coming to the right conclusions? When it's a theoretical conversation, a philosophical conversation, a mystical conversation, or just a theoretical conversation about something that could happen one day, then we can debate back and forth. But whatever the answer is, it doesn't really make a practical difference. There's no practical implication if it never takes that scenario never happens and never takes place. But if there's a situation on the table currently, we need to know, can this specific device, for example, be used on Shabbat? Then we have to look at all the mechanisms within the device, how it works, look at all the mechanisms within Shabbos, within Shabbat, how do they work, and match them up and see, is this something that is permissible to do or something that's not permissible to do? So when it comes to defining, figuring out what we need to do, when it's actually, there's a practical implication, then we have to work much harder at it, and then whatever the conclusion is, actually has a practical ramification to it. So when we study Torah in order to come to the right conclusion, especially when it's coming to practical action of what we should and shouldn't be doing, then we specifically need divine assistance to make sure that we're coming to the right conclusion. Because if we come to the wrong conclusion, then we're going to be doing something that's against what Hashem wants. So how do we do that is by recognizing that we need a dose of divine assistance. It's not that, I studied so much, I learned so much that I'll go figure it out. Every respectable rabbi recognizes, or should recognize at least, that their ability to give halachic rulings on things and to give advice on how a person should behave, as much as we study, as much as we learn, we need a good dose of Hashem's assistance to make sure that what we say to the right people, it's the right thing to say at the right time to the right person to come to the right conclusion and the right outcome. And then, when we have that recognition, we make ourselves a vessel to receiving the blessings of Hashem to actually understand correctly and appropriately and come to the right conclusions. Finally, we come to the fifth step. Once we have humility, we've got our devotion set aside, like Yehoshua. We have our, just like the Zakenim acquired through working hard at it. We're ready to work hard at it. We recognize that we need a dose of Hashem's assistance to actually come to the right conclusion. Then comes the final step of the men of the Great Assembly, which studied, the whole purpose of their study was to observe. The sages taught one cannot derive a practical ruling from theoretical study, nor from witnessing someone's practical example, but only after inquiring as the correct ruling and being explicitly told what to do. So just by theoretical study, we can't jump to conclusions. By witnessing what someone did doesn't tell us the reasons behind it. How can we come to the correct ruling? By understanding what the situation is, what's done, and inquiring from our teachers why it is this way, the different angles of the whole thing, and then we can come to a practical solution. When the study is relevant to actual practice, it is of a completely different quality. Chassidut explains that when a person is studying in order to reach a practical halachic conclusion, the effort they exert is much greater, and this helps them reach the correct conclusion. This was the role of the men of the Great Assembly, to issue practical halachic rulings and enactments. So, step number 4, recognizing that you need divine intervention, you need Hashem's assistance to come to the right conclusions. The 5th step is making sure that whenever we're learning, we don't just leave that learning to be something esoterical, something that doesn't relate to us, something abstract that doesn't have to do with us. The concept of the great men of the Great Assembly, Anshe Knesset Agdola, was they made practical halachic rulings and tried to bring solutions to many of the outstanding things that were not understood up until that point, giving us practical ideas how to protect the Torah and how to make sure it continues for many more generations to come. Same thing to ourselves. With all of our learning, we should make sure that every time we sit down and study and learn something, there's something practical that we can take out of it, some practical lesson that we take out from it, and then the Torah will continue on for future generations. So with Hashem's help, we should all excel in all 5 of these areas and continue studying, continue learning, continue to grow in our connection to Hashem, our connection to the Jewish people. Collectively together, through us all putting in our best effort, will merit the coming of Mashiach, and then we'll see how all of this works.